May 27, 1942. Prague. A man named Jozef Gabčík steps into the street, raising a crude metal tube toward an open-topped Mercedes, carrying one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, Reinhard Heydrich, architect of the Holocaust. Gabčík pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. The weapon, a British Sten gun, has jammed. In that frozen moment, the entire mission appears to collapse. Heydrich, instead of fleeing, orders his driver to stop and stands up to shoot back. It's a fatal mistake. Gabčík's partner hurls a grenade that will ultimately kill the Nazi butcher. But that jammed Sten gun tells you everything you need to know about one of World War II's most important weapons. Soldiers hated it. Called it Plumber's nightmare, Plumber's abortion, the Stench Gun. It was crude, unreliable, and looked like it had been assembled in someone's garage. Yet this ugly Tudor weapon became the second most produced submachine gun of World War II and quite possibly saved Britain from Nazi invasion. This is the story of how desperation created a weapon that changed the war. June 4, 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk fall silent. Over 338,000 Allied troops have been miraculously evacuated to England, but they've left behind something catastrophic: nearly all their equipment. The numbers are staggering. The British Army abandoned 11,000 machine guns, 2,500 artillery pieces, 650 tanks, 65,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of rifles on French beaches. Soldiers wading into the Channel had dropped their weapons to avoid drowning. Those who made it directly onto destroyers kept their rifles, but they were the minority. Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before Parliament and called it a colossal military disaster. He was right. Britain now had enough heavy equipment to properly arm just 2 full-strength divisions, approximately 15,000 men. And across the English Channel, Hitler was assembling invasion forces. The equation was simple and terrifying. Britain needed weapons, millions of them, immediately. The traditional British approach to firearms wouldn't work. Precision manufacturing, extensive machining, careful quality control. These processes produced excellent weapons, like the Lee Enfield rifle. But they were slow, expensive, resource-intensive. Britain didn't have time for excellence. They needed quantity, and they needed it now. Meanwhile, reports flooded in from the continent. German troops with MP-40 submachine guns were dominating close-quarters combat. The Americans had the Thompson, but at $200 per unit, over $4,400 in today's money, it was astronomically expensive. Congress had mandated that any war materials sold to Britain be paid for in gold, and the nation's gold reserves were vanishing fast. Britain tried purchasing every Thompson it could find, but once America entered the war, supply evaporated. They experimented with copies of captured German weapons. They produced 50,000 Lanchester submachine guns, beautifully made, but heavy, complicated, and expensive. None of it was enough. In the autumn of 1940, with German bombers pounding London nightly and invasion seeming inevitable, the British military issued an impossible mandate to 2 designers, Major Reginald Fye Shepherd and Harold Turpin at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. Create a submachine gun that can be mass-produced using minimal machinery, materials, and skilled labor. Make it cheap. Make it fast. Make it now. December 1940 to January 1941. In just 36 days, Harold Turpin handmade the first Sten gun prototype at the Philco Radio Works. When military officials first saw it, many thought it was a joke. The weapon looked like plumbing supplies welded together by someone who'd never seen a real gun. The barrel was a simple steel tube. The receiver was a larger steel tube. The magazine jutted horizontally from the left side, not because it was clever design, but because vertical feeding required too much machining time. There was no wooden furniture, no careful finishing. no attention to aesthetics whatsoever. The stock on the Mark I was a crude metal frame. Later versions would eliminate even that. Every single design choice was dictated by one question: can this be stamped, welded, or assembled faster? Shepherd and Turpin had created something revolutionary, not through innovation, but through ruthless elimination. Every component that wasn't absolutely necessary was deleted. Every manufacturing step that required skilled labor was redesigned. Parts that would normally be milled from solid steel were stamped from sheet metal. The barrel used a cold hammering process that took minutes instead of hours. The weapon had just 47 parts in its simplest configuration. It could be produced using metal stamping techniques that required minimal machining. Most remarkably, much of the production could be performed by small workshops with no firearms experience, then assembled at Enfield. And the cost? Approximately $2 per unit. That's roughly $10 in 1940 American dollars, about $130 in today's money. You could produce 15 Sten guns for the price of a single Thompson submachine gun. On March 7, 1941, just 2 months after the first prototype, the weapon was approved for production. The British government placed an immediate order for 300,000 units, delivery to begin in October. The first batch was delivered on October 21, 1941, right on schedule. The weapon was named Sten, an acronym derived from Shepherd, Turpin, and Enfield. Military officials called it one of the best bits of design on small arms carried out in England for a very long time. The soldiers who had to carry it had other names for it, most of them unprintable. Ask a British infantryman what he thought of the Sten gun and prepare for a creative vocabulary lesson. The weapon jammed constantly, especially when dirty or wet, which in combat conditions meant always. The side-mounted magazine was prone to damage and feeding failures. The Sten had a terrifying tendency to fire when dropped. The simple sear mechanism meant accidental discharges were common enough to be genuinely dangerous. The single-column magazine was finicky and required careful loading. The stamped metal construction meant parts wore out quickly. The crude sights made accurate fire nearly impossible beyond close range. The lack of a proper stock on most models meant the weapon had terrible ergonomics. And that skeletal metal stock on early versions? It was like pressing a medieval torture device against your shoulder. British troops who could get their hands on captured German MP-40s or American Thompsons would often ditch their Stens without hesitation. The weapon felt cheap because it was cheap. But here's what history often overlooks. The Sten gun's flaws in conventional warfare were utterly irrelevant compared to its revolutionary value in irregular warfare. While British soldiers cursed the Sten in training camps, a different group of people were receiving the weapon with something approaching reverence: resistance fighters across occupied Europe. Winston Churchill had created the Special Operations Executive with one mission: set Europe ablaze. The SOE needed weapons that could be produced in massive quantities, transported secretly, assembled by non-experts, maintained with minimal training, and replaced without regret if captured or destroyed. The Sten gun met every single one of these requirements perfectly. Its simplicity meant resistance fighters could be trained to use it in under an hour. Its low cost meant SOE could afford to parachute thousands of them into occupied territory. Its ease of manufacture meant clandestine workshops could produce crude but functional copies from basic materials. Most importantly, its effectiveness at close range made it devastating for the kind of warfare the resistance was fighting: ambushes, assassinations, raids conducted at distances measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. The horizontal magazine, despised by regular troops, became an advantage. In tight urban spaces, a vertical magazine might snag on door frames or vehicle interiors. The Sten's side-loading design was actually better for concealment and guerrilla warfare. The crude sights, inadequate for aimed fire at range, were perfectly sufficient when the target was a German convoy at 10 meters or a collaborator at 5. The weapon could be disassembled in seconds and hidden in a shopping basket or small suitcase. A skilled operative could reassemble it and have it ready to fire in under 30 seconds. And then there was the ammunition. The Sten fired 9mm parabellum, the same cartridge used by German weapons. Resistance fighters could scavenge ammunition from enemy supplies, from captured weapons, even from the bodies of German soldiers. Between 1941 and 1945, Britain produced approximately 4 million Sten guns, but the official production numbers don't tell the full story. Resistance groups across occupied Europe set up underground workshops and manufactured their own copies. In Poland, at least 23 underground workshops produced Sten copies before the 1944 Warsaw Uprising. Over 2,000 Stens were manufactured in occupied Poland alone. Polish engineers even designed their own improved version, called the Błyskawica. Danish resistance groups like BOPA and Holger Danske built hundreds in Copenhagen workshops, hidden in bicycle repair shops, and construction company facilities. French Maquis fighters received tens of thousands through SOE airdrops and built more in clandestine workshops. Yugoslav partisans armed with British-supplied Stens fought pitched battles against Wehrmacht units. The Sten became the iconic weapon of European resistance, crude, improvised, lethal. But what made the Sten truly distinctive wasn't just what it could do. It was the sound it made. The Sten fired from an open bolt at approximately 550 rounds per minute. It had a distinctive mechanical rattle, cheap, crude, unmistakable. German soldiers learned to recognize that sound instantly. And in the narrow streets of occupied cities, that sound meant one thing: ambush. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. German occupation forces across Europe came to fear that rattling sound. It meant resistance fighters were close, were armed, were willing to kill. The crude clatter of a Sten echoing off building walls became the soundtrack to Germany's losing war against the people it had tried to subjugate. In Warsaw during the 1944 uprising, Polish Home Army fighters used Stens to defend the city for 63 days against superior German forces. German soldiers would retreat at the first burst of Sten fire, unwilling to risk close combat with fighters who had learned to use the weapon with devastating efficiency. In France, Maquis fighters used Stens to attack German convoys, pin down patrols, and execute collaborators. By June 1944, the French resistance numbered nearly 400,000, with a quarter of some units equipped primarily with Stens. The Sten had a variant that made it even more terrifying: the Mark IIs, the suppressed version. The S stood for Special Purpose, and it was designed specifically for assassinations and covert operations. With a 22.5-inch suppressor, the weapon was extremely quiet while maintaining its rate of fire. It became the most effective covert weapon of the war. Resistance fighters could eliminate German officers, collaborators, and Gestapo agents in crowded cafes, darkened streets, or occupied buildings. The suppressed Sten made it possible to kill and disappear before anyone even realized what had happened. Let's return to that morning in Prague, May 27, 1942. Jozef Gabčík's Sten jams at the crucial moment. This wasn't unusual. The Sten was prone to jamming, especially if the magazine wasn't properly seated or if dirt got into the mechanism. In that frozen moment, years of planning seemed to collapse, but Gabčík's partner, Jan Kubiš, had a contingency. He threw a modified anti-tank grenade that struck Heydrich's Mercedes. Shrapnel and debris from the car's upholstery embedded in Heydrich's body. 8 days later, the architect of the Holocaust died of sepsis. The irony is this: That jammed Sten gun has been used for decades as evidence of the weapon's unreliability, but the operation succeeded anyway. And the broader story of the Sten isn't about one dramatic failure. It's about thousands of quiet successes. The Nazi reprisals were brutal. The villages of Lidice and Ležáky were razed. Over 5,000 Czechs were killed in the aftermath. But the assassination achieved its goals. It proved that Nazi leaders weren't untouchable. It gained worldwide sympathy for the Czech cause, and it led to Britain repealing the Munich Agreement. One jammed Sten in Prague doesn't erase the thousands of Stens that worked exactly as intended in ambushes, assassinations, and firefights across occupied Europe. By the time the war ended, more than 4 million Stens had been produced, making it the second most produced submachine gun of World War II after the Soviet PPSH-41. But its impact went far beyond the numbers. The Sten proved something that military establishments have often been reluctant to acknowledge. In irregular warfare, the perfect is the enemy of the good. A crude weapon that exists is infinitely more valuable than an elegant weapon that doesn't. A firearm that can be manufactured by the millions and distributed without regard for cost or aesthetics will always be more strategically important than a masterpiece produced in limited quantities. The German military was so impressed by the Sten's simplicity that they copied it. In late 1944, facing desperate shortages, they produced their own version called the Gerrit Potsdam and a modified variant, the MP 3008, as last-ditch weapons for the Volksturm. Think about that. The Germans, famous for precision engineering, for producing weapons like the MG42 and the MP40, were copying the crude British Plumber's nightmare because it was faster and cheaper to produce than their own designs. The Sten's design philosophy influenced nearly every insurgent weapon developed in the decades that followed. The Israeli Uzi, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, even the British Sterling that eventually replaced the Sten, all owed a debt to Shepard and Turpin's ungainly creation. But more than any specific weapon design, the Sten established a principle that simplicity, mass production, and ease of manufacture could be more important than perfection. That you could win a war not with the best weapon, but with the weapon you could actually get into fighters' hands. The Sten gun was ugly. It was unreliable. It cost $2 to produce. Soldiers hated it. Military purists dismissed it. The Thompson submachine gun was superior in almost every measurable way. And yet, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, facing invasion with barely enough equipment to arm 2 divisions, it was the Sten that saved them. When resistance fighters across occupied Europe needed weapons that could be smuggled, hidden, and used against an enemy with vastly superior firepower, it was the Sten that armed them. When the Special Operations Executive needed a weapon that could be manufactured in underground workshops by people who'd never made a firearm, it was the Sten that they copied. 4 million weapons produced in just 4 years. Countless more manufactured in secret workshops, used in every theater of war, dropped by parachute into occupied territories, built by women in British factories and by resistance fighters in basement workshops. The Sten wasn't the best weapon of World War II, but it might have been the most important, because it existed in the quantities needed, exactly when it was needed most. Sometimes, the most significant tools in history aren't the ones people wanted to make beautiful. They're the ones that simply had to work. And the Sten gun, ugly as it was, worked exactly when and where it mattered most. That crude, metallic rattle echoing through the streets of occupied Europe wasn't just the sound of a cheap submachine gun. It was the sound of resistance, the sound of refusal to submit. The sound of people fighting back with whatever weapons they could get their hands on, and to German soldiers hearing it in a darkened alley, knowing that armed fighters were close and coming, it was one of the most terrifying sounds in the world.